Uh, Good morning, everyone. I think we're still in the morning part of the session. And welcome to our first panel discussion that promises a very good introduction from our panelists and a very interesting topic on very interesting topics concerning the Balkans and the shifting alliances and influences of big powers that has been going on for the last decade and has certainly intensified as the US has sort of moved a little bit into the background and maybe reached out to the Middle East more decisively. And the European Union has struggled to bring solutions to different problems at its periphery. In recent years, Russia and Turkey and the Middle Eastern countries, mostly the Gulf countries, have been trying to get there, if I may use the word proxies in different countries in the Balkans. And the question that our distinguished panelists are going to be addressing here is how we can bring the Western Balkan countries back into the Euro-Atlantic sphere of influence, or back, not just, they're not gone, but just maybe enforce their values across the region. The first speaker is going to be, I'm very pleased to introduce the three panelists, and the first one to speak on this topic is Dimitar Bechev. He is the research fellow at the Center for Slavic, Eurasian, and East European Studies at University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. He is the author of many interesting studies and papers, but I have his book that is timely and wonderful, and if anybody is interested in reading a book about what Russia is thinking and doing in Southeastern Europe and in Western Balkans, please pick up this book. I think it's going to be outside after the talk. The two other panelists are Molly McKew. She is the president of Fianna Strategists, and she is also going to speak about the Russian influence around the region. And then very pleased to say that next to me is Molly Montgomery. She is the special advisor for Europe and Russia in the Office of the Vice President, and a very welcome voice of this administration to explain to us what the plans are and the thinking is in the administration. And I think we're a little bit privileged that we're going to hear this today. Thank you very much. And Dimitar, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Barbara, and thanks to the Atlantic Council for convening this excellent event. We need to talk about the Balkans. There is unfinished business, and there's a lot going on in the region. So my brief was to talk Russia, but since we have a number of other speakers, I'll probably say a few words about the larger landscape and end up mentioning Russia. The Balkans is the EU periphery. It's very much integrated into the EU. If you look at trade, investment, visa-free travel, people working or pursuing life opportunities, the region is encapsulated by EU territory. Sometimes the whole discourse about EU as being far away and not opening its doors is misplaced, because for all intents and purposes, the region is already inside the EU, and that's something that's really important to reiterate. All these other powers play a secondary role when it comes to the hard facts on the ground, the economy and society. So that's one. The problem with the EU is that it's not delivering the goods. It's not delivering democratization, and it's not delivering good governance. Or if it does deliver, it happens in very small motion. So there is marginal improvements. But the overreaching trends in the Western Balkans are towards decay or stagnation in democratic institutions. You see it very clearly in media, but also elsewhere. And it's a great environment for other players to interfere. when you have corruption, when you have state capture, when you have resentment against the West, this is the kind of environment that helps all those spoilers, including Russia, but also others, to have influence and to exercise with very limited resources, I must say, their agendas. All things being equal, the Balkans will probably make it into the EU, but they won't become a member state like Denmark or Sweden. They'll become a replica of Hungary. That's the default, unfortunately. And back in the day, Russia was happy with this scenario. It didn't mind having another Cyprus, another Hungary as member state. If Serbia was to join, I mean, that was another ally in Brussels. The question is why now they became opposed not just to NATO enlargement, but also to the EU enlargement. And I think it has to do with the overall pattern of relations. In the 2000s, Russia had a moderately positive relationship with the EU. Of course, there were conflicts, but also there was cooperation in the energy sector and elsewhere. But after Ukraine, it became a zero-sum game. So the Russian thinking is, you Europeans, Americans are meddling in our backyard in Georgia and Moldova. Well, we can do the same in the Balkans. I mean, there are so many factors that kind of help us to run our horse in this part of Europe. And it doesn't take much to be present there. With relatively little money, you can have maximum effect. Because there is an audience in Serbia, in Montenegro, in Macedonia, but also in the wider region of Southeast Europe, which is the subject of my book, in Greece, in Bulgaria, even Turkey these days. You have audience which resents the West, which buys into all those stories about the arrogance of NATO. And this is praying to the choir. It's very easy. Secondly, you have the same software operating in those societies. Hardware might be different in the sense that the Balkans are integrated into the West, but the software of how you do business in government, how you engage with public companies, how you control the coercive apparatus, the security services, how you influence media, is not very different from what happens in Russia. It just the scale is not the same. We can speak the same language as Russians and infiltrate. Of course, it's not just the Kremlin. There are lots of freelancers, and I think that's the story in Montenegro. It was a freelance operation that was taken over with the coup planned by the Russian state later on. And certainly all these factors, the resentment and the weak governance in the region, makes it a very open environment for this kind of spoiler action. But one thing to reiterate, and maybe this is where Molly and I disagree, and the other Molly as well, I don't think Russia has a positive long-term agenda. I don't think they want to bring the Balkans under their fold. I don't think they want to or have the means to bankroll governments. They just want to obstruct the West and in the game of competing with the West and maybe looking for a deal. But if you go back to my book and there is a stall selling it at a discount price, one thing that I want to hammer on is that it's a game which involves two sides. Very often analysts think that Balkan politicians, parties are in Russia's pockets, but they've been playing a double game. It's the same Titoist mentality. You want to be with the West and get all the benefits, but you want to be with the Russians as well. And the Kremlin is very cynical. They know that they cannot trust Balkan politicians. If push comes to shove, they'll go for the West. I don't have any doubt that applies even to Serbia, because this is where money is, this is where power lies. But one policy recommendation, and it's in tune also with the excellent report Damir and Damon and Sarah put together, is that if you want to deal with all those spoilers, the Russians, but also the Turks to some extent, and the Gulf, is to look at the root causes, which is, again, state capture and poor governance. It's all right for Russian business to be present in the Balkans, as long as they play by the rules and abide by the rule of law. It's an open field, and everybody has the right to compete and to work in this market. But the rules have to apply. So it's not just about Russian interference or dirty money from the Gulf or the Turks messing around. It's also about setting the conditions to consolidate democracy and to consolidate the rule of law. And I think that's the key message that we should be focusing on, not just looking at the symptoms, but the root causes.
Thank you, Dimitar. Molly, you
Great.
have the word.
Well, actually, I don't think we disagree.
All right.
So I do think very much that, and I'll focus on sort of Russian influence in the Balkans, as that is the piece of this that I know, and sort of maybe make 3 points, sort of 3 broad points about. We were discussing before, you can roll out the diplomatic statements about the Balkans today, very similar to 15 years ago. So what's really different? How do we understand what's happening now? In sort of with sort of a new lens. So maybe I'll just sort of add 3 points to supplement everything that you just said, which I totally agree with. I do think the Russian strategy, as much as there is a strategy, it's just to leave the black hole in the middle of NATO and the EU. And the more that can be there, the more they feel that is a lane that they can maneuver and manipulate when needed. But I do think there's not a positive. They sort of make noises about building an alliance structure in the region, but there's very little sign that any of that is actually happening. So what's different? I would say there's sort of 3 things that are different now in terms of what we need to look at. One is the way that Russia acts, and I think that you actually had some really great comments leading into that. There is this sort of Gerasimov-style informal means of operating in the Balkans, and right now very much focuses on intelligence, sort of the intelligence apparatuses in the region, sort of a range of informal actors, heavily focused on information space and information operations, and also on military cooperation, formal and informal, which I think is worth noting. I think the fact that the Kremlin has promoted intelligence actors to kind of take over the Balkan portfolio is really important to pay attention to. I think that indicates those are the lanes they're going to be focused on, sort of the more shadowy, covert means of influence and operation, less diplomatic format. The military cooperation will continue, but all of the informal actors, be they financial or commercial, sort of media, cultural, and otherwise, will be the primary focus moving forward. I think there is this sort of wider Russian action and attention to the region, and since they're using these new range of actors, there is this broader stomach for risk-taking and boldness that I think is really worth paying attention to. You mentioned the Montenegro assassination attempt, which was linked to the GRU, and I think that there's so many elements of that were really surprising. One, that there's been virtually no consequences to Russia for doing this. There's been very little response from the EU or the US for the fact that a Russian intelligence operation tried to assassinate the prime minister of a now NATO ally country. That these were actors who had previously been kicked out of Poland for similar types of activities, so they were known operatives, sort of moving around that nobody stopped. But this sort of level of the lack of caution and the sort of increased level of risk-taking that we see in the Balkans is interesting because it's not that way in other places. I think if you look at some of the operations in the US and in Western Europe, there's always this 3 steps back, caution, deniability approach. So they can say, oh, it's not us, it's just some businessman. Oh, it's not us, it's an informal operation. But I think in the Balkans there's been increased activity that is worth paying attention to because there is this sort of sense that they can operate however they want and no one else is there competing with their influence. And I think part of that gets to the fact that Russia has not really been paying any consequences for anything that they're doing virtually anywhere. The military cooperation is interesting because it is fairly low key. There's, I think numerically, if you look at cooperation or training exercises with the West versus Russia, much lower on the Russian side, but Russia has these purposeful interventions like giving or selling Serbia 6 fighter jets that are now the most significant air force in the region. That has purpose, that matters, that has a lot of influence in terms of what it impacts on the ground because training is great and everybody loves it, interoperability is very important, but a fighter jet is a fighter jet and that does actually move the needle. The heavy intelligence presence is something we need to pay attention to moving forward because it is linked to the increased Russian attention to information space in the Balkans. and the heavy investments into local language media resources, which are amplified by dozens, if not hundreds, of local outlets and actors and sort of echo chamber advocates that are sort of in the lanes we all understand, you know, softly anti-NATO, softly Russia is great, softly promoting the pan-Slavic unity that is always sort of trickling around in that narrative, but much more purposefully is promoting, and materially so, a range of more pro-Russian actors and politicians in the political space, be they parties or individuals. That is having a significant impact. These people are winning elections and getting into parliaments, maybe not taking over governments, but they do have more of a presence than they used to because they're supported by a fairly significant media operation, and that's worth paying attention to. The other aspect of what Russian information is doing is kind of keeping a simmer on all of the local inter-ethnic hostilities, things that you can pull triggers on if you need a conflict to appear at a given moment. And I think on the other side of that, we, the West, be that the United States or the EU, have really failed to offer any narrative in that space to counter what Russia is doing. There's no compelling narrative about what the Balkans means in the EU, about how they fit into our security architecture. There really is this absence of you know, who you are and what you're doing in comparison to what the Russians are presenting as a sort of this very emotional connection. Because you know, what you said is also right, that the only future for the Balkans economically is with the EU, and they know that, and they want that. But this sort of emotive connection is one that the Russians are very good at pulling on. I think the second big difference is that the U.S. is really absent from the region, and we have been for a long time. I think what we see right now is a drift forward of Obama-era policies that I think were kind of reinforced nothingness. There were a lot of sort of tactical level interactions that were important, and certainly diplomats do their jobs, but what's the vision and for what end? I think this kind of you know, the narrative, the storytelling, why we all belong together, what's the role of an integrated Europe, what's the role of the transatlantic alliance moving forward. We're not hearing that kind of discussion anymore, and it really matters when you're talking about dragging a region forward into fairly complicated reforms and painful local reforms that would have to happen in terms of anti-corruption, security architecture, and everything else. The vision and the narrative really matters, and we're not really presenting one in a way that I think would help locally. I also just think there's the perception that we have been more absent, whether that is real or not, and I know that some would debate whether or not that is true. I think the local perception is the U.S. is not there, but we need to be there in a more aggressive way to give Balkan nations a choice against Russia, against Turkey, against other actors who are working in the region. We are not providing the same type of choice that we previously did. And I think there have been some really positive things in the new administration. That Vice President Pence went to the region is very important. That sort of below the top level, there is a sense that there are good, smart actors engaged on regional issues, but it's that lack of top-level engagement and policy articulation that is unnerving to people. And you hear it on Ukraine, you hear it in the Balkans, you hear it in the Caucasus. What does it mean that our president cannot articulate a policy on Russia? What does it mean that there's no real nod toward most of these things at the highest level? Do you listen to the local diplomats or do you not? And you hear this kind of churn everywhere in the region, and that really matters. The fact that people don't really know who to listen to or who's in charge. We need to clarify our policy, we need to clarify our vision for the region, for the transatlantic alliance, and the president needs to be engaged in that or it's just not gonna matter. And I think the third thing, and I'll sum up quickly, is just what the other thing that's different is the range of actors that Russia is using in the region for its missions, and I think that's really important, partially their own. The other aspect of this being the new alliance structure that Russia really relies on. It is very informal, but the Turks are very integrated into Russian action. The Iranians are very integrated into Russian action. Increasingly, Russia plays an outsized role in the Middle East on sides that they previously were not on, and all of those actors, I think, sort of come together in the Balkans in the way that Russia is operating, which is sort of a giant one-front war. where Ukraine and Syria and everything else are sort of connected to a new sweeping engagement strategy for how they're positioning and moving forward. I think there's a range of options that Russia's preparing in the Balkans in terms of political actors and potential unrest to keep their interests sort of fortified. There is this sort of split, that the two chairs analogy that I think is very true, that many of the Balkan nations, especially Serbia, have tried to play both sides for a long time, sometimes to their advantage, often not. And there does need to be both a recommitment from the EU and the US to bring these nations in fully as partners or allies, but there also needs to be the commitment from the other side to do the work that needs to get done to accomplish those things. But I think we need to present a better narrative to the region about who we all are together, and give people real choices against the very material benefits that Russia presents to its friends in the region. Russia uses the empty space against us, and we've been giving them an open battle space for way too long, and we need to have something in that space to stop them, or we're going to find more black holes in all of our security architecture and everything else.
Great. Well, I think, Molly, you teed me up pretty well, and hopefully I can assuage some of your fears that, the United States is not prepared to leave a vacuum in the Western Balkans. But first, let me just say a big thank you to the Atlantic Council for organizing today's conference and for putting a spotlight on a region that is a priority for the administration, and as Dimitar said, that we probably don't talk about enough. And it's wonderful to have ministers from around the region here as well, not just today as we take stock and collectively think about the way forward, but also as an opportunity for the administration to deepen our relationships in the region and to work together on ways that we can cooperate further. I agree with a lot that's been said in terms of the diagnosis of the problem and some of what's been said already about the cure as well. Obviously in the last several years, we've seen a real increase in Russian engagement and malign influence in the Western Balkans, and we've seen them using the same kinds of tools that they've used for a long time in places like Ukraine and the Baltics. Obviously, as we've all said, I think at this point, the attempted coup in Montenegro was the most dramatic example, but we've also seen attempts to isolate Kosovo. We've seen support for anti-Dayton and secessionist rhetoric in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And we've seen, as Molly really outlined well, just a widespread campaign to spread disinformation and fake news in an attempt to sow distrust and to undermine pro-Western policies and leaders. And all of that really fits under the headline of trying to divide partners and neighbors and trying to stymie the progress of the region toward the EU and NATO. And unfortunately, as Dimitar said really well, the Russians have found fertile ground in the region. And that's because of things like institutional weakness, democratic backsliding that we've seen over the last number of years, endemic corruption, and historical divisions based on ethnicity. So the question remains, what can we do and what are we doing? And my message today is really the same as what the Vice President's was when he visited Podgorica and participated in the Adriatic Charter Summit in August, and that is that the United States must be and is unequivocally committed to the region, to the Euro-Atlantic integration of the countries of the region, and to a more peaceful, prosperous, and European future for all of the people of the region. And that message is being carried not just at the high levels, like he did in Podgorica, but also by colleagues like Assistant Secretary Wes Mitchell, Daswat Yi, who you will hear later today, and also by our colleagues at embassies in the region on a daily basis. As Molly said, diplomats continue their work. The second thing that we're committed to is working with our European partners hand in glove to support the region and its Euro-Atlantic integration. We know from experience in the Western Balkans and beyond that our unity is our greatest strength. And we think that this is a great opportunity for us to demonstrate the strength of the US-EU relationship and what we can achieve together if we coordinate our messages, if we coordinate our goals, obviously, and also our tactics. And so that coordination is happening. It's happening at a high level in the conversations that the Vice President has with High Representative Montgomery on a regular basis about the region. And it's happening all the way down to the conversations that are happening in capitals between our embassies and EU and member state missions. And so we're committed to working with our European partners to advance the Euro-Atlantic aspirations of the countries of the region and our larger and long-standing goal of a Europe free, whole, and at peace. And this is where I might disagree a little bit with Molly. I think, it's an oldie, but it's a goodie, and there are some things that don't need to change, and our commitment to the region and to that goal is one of them. We also need to make sure that we work together with European partners to keep NATO's door open. And we saw in June with Montenegro's accession to the alliance that is the case, but we need to recommit ourselves to that for other aspirants when they are ready. And we also need to work together to ensure progress toward accession to the European Union. Finally, and probably most importantly, the best way, as Dimitar said, to inoculate ourselves against Russian malign influence is really to carry out the reforms that are going to strengthen the rule of law, that are going to promote good governance, that will create economic opportunity, and that will fight corruption. And these reforms are going to lead to improvements in people's day-to-day lives. They will help to strengthen institutions and societies and build resilience that will build resilience to threats, to stability, and to democracy in the region. Incidentally, these are the same reforms that are required to fulfill the Euro-Atlantic aspirations that the countries of the region have as well. And while the US will stand behind the countries of the region as they look to achieve these reforms and work beside them as we have for the last several decades, it is up to the leaders of the region to take up this task and to take it up with the urgency that it requires. It is difficult. It will require a lot of tough decisions and significant political will, but it is the only way to achieve both that resilience to malign influence, but also to progress down the European path that the countries of the region have set for themselves. So my message is that the United States will stand behind the countries of the region as they work to complete the unfinished business of Europe, and as we all seek to make the Western Balkans part of a Europe free, whole, and at peace. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all three of the panelists. I think they gave us a lot of reasons to ask questions. I would certainly love to be in a position to ask questions, but today I am on the other side, so I hope you will indulge me when I point to you in a hopefully not rude way. There is a microphone. Usually I'm on your end of the audience. There are microphones here, so please raise your hand and you will get a microphone to ask a question. The gentleman over there, please, in the last row in the jacket. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Kurt Bessiner from Democratization Policy Council. I wanted to ask a question about the energy element of the Russian engagement. Not long ago, the EU did something that I wished would be replicated throughout its sort of policy portfolio on South Stream. It took a very hard line on South Stream, and it forced not only aspirants, but EU members to play ball. Do you see that? Is that something that you see as a model for stronger, more values and security related engagement that we could collaborate on? And on a follow on the energy element, energy independence is a big deal. They have really terrible energy efficiency in the region, and that's why Sarajevo and Skopje are terribly polluted cities. Is this something that where you could see a collaborative effort? Because I don't see a lot of effort on energy efficiency, which is one of the easier ways to remove that vulnerability to Russian gas. Thank you.
Sorry, is your question for someone specific
It's
on the panel?
It's for anybody
or all
on
of
the
them?
panel who might want to field it. Thank you.
Any of you would like? Dimitar, maybe you want
Yeah,
to
let's
start?
challenge a myth. The Balkans is not dependent on Russian gas, because if you look at the volumes consumed, very limited. I mean, Croatia is a big consumer, but it's an indigenous production. And after the 2009 cutoff, it ended its long-term contract. Russian gas is not as prevalent as in Central Europe or in the post-Soviet space. But problems in the energy sector go deeper than Russia, and it chimes in with what I had to say about good governance. I mean, in Serbia, you have Serbia Gas as a state company. It's always been a political fiefdom. I mean, it was under Koštunica, and now it's under the Socialist Party, the same person in charge. I mean, how are those utility companies managed? How much money is spent, and what are the outcomes? These are the questions we should be asking. And now, once this is sorted out, you have a competitive market where gas is there, but also there are other sources of energy, and certainly pollution and renewables are into the picture. Then you have a very dynamic market. But the root cause of all the ills we experience have to do with the state-run companies and the inefficiency and the rent-seeking in the sector. South Stream, yeah, I mean, the EU had a principled ground, but to give credit to the EU, it was flexible as well. There was a working group to work out how South Stream could fit the third energy package. And the reason that there was no compromise was Crimea. Once politics interfered, Crimea was off. On South Stream, there could have been a compromise. But the real issue of South Stream was not whether Russia or somebody else was to build a pipeline, but the small print of the pipeline. I mean, who was paying for it? What would be the returns? What would be the price of the gas sold there? I mean, just to give you an example about Bulgaria, which is the country I know best, and it's in the book as well. South Stream's cost in Bulgaria tripled over the lifespan of the project before it died. And it tripled not because of the Russians, but because of the Bulgarian government, and all the parties had their own businesses plugged into the deal as subcontractors. So there would be money to be distributed all around. And that's the real problem, that those energy projects turn, with Russian collusion, I might say, into large-scale state capture endeavors. Serbia, not very different as well, just that the Russians had a larger stake. Macedonia, same guy, Gennady Timchenko, close friend of Putin, involved in overhauling the Macedonian gas system. Yeah, so it's not very often high politics. It's about rent-seeking, both in Russia but also in the Balkans, coming together, colliding, and damaging public interest in Russia but also in Southeast Europe. That's the story we should be looking at, not the fears of Russia capturing the energy market.
Maybe I can jump in as well. I mean, we strongly support diversity of supply and projects, whether Kirk or TAP or the Bulgaria-Serbia interconnector that can help contribute to that. Obviously, we're also excited about the introduction of US LNG to markets in Europe and the opportunities that provides. In terms of the energy efficiency question, I mean, I think those there are opportunities clearly, but where those problems have been solved most effectively, it's through private sector means. And so there are lots of American companies that are great at that work, but market conditions and the business environment have to be such that it will incentivize their participation. And so I think that really goes to Dimitar's point as well about creating an environment that is ripe for that sort of cooperation and those sorts of business opportunities.
Just one question about that, if I may. The president, during the 3Cs conference in Poland, I think the president mentioned such project in Croatia, is that correct?
Right, the Kirk project.
Yeah, the Kirk project, exactly. Please, let's continue with questions. The gentleman over there, please. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Ari Middleman with Geostrategic. I don't want to minimize the discussion of Russia, but as we know, President Trump and the whole administration is quite focused on our Asian partners. And just, 10 days ago, President Trump returned from Asia. And in the last 10 days, we look at what China's done across the region. Maribor Airport, all the way down through thermal plants in Bosnia, potential direct flights to Zagreb, the list goes on, railways in Macedonia. I was wondering if you could speak about Chinese influence in the region.
Thank you very much.
Shall we take one by one, or?
Yes, if you would all like to answer, I would really.
I mean, China is there. You have the C16+1. Belgrade had the summit 2 years ago, and now in Budapest. I'm not sure that there is a political agenda attached, but certainly from a Chinese perspective, looking at not just the Western Balkans, but the larger Central Eastern European plus Balkan grouping is good diplomatically, because it's a way to divide and conquer the Europeans. As long as there are different groupings striking separate deals with the Chinese, there won't be a unified position, speaking with one voice. So that's the political agenda. Regional governments will continue courting the Chinese, because after 2008, there is a shortage of investment. The whole political economy of the region changed with the global economic crisis. So anybody is welcome, the Russians, the Chinese, the Gulf money in this environment. That's the mindset. And it would be foolish for the Chinese not to take this opportunity. I'm not sure how much the projects are paying off, given all the constraints and shortcomings in the business environment, and that's something to consider. And if you look at the larger regions, sometimes the Chinese had expectations that didn't deliver. What I have in mind is the whole story about the highway in Poland, whereas, I mean, the Chinese were there, but they expected they could do business in Central and Eastern Europe the way they do business in Africa, bringing their own labor. And it's not the way it works. I mean, you have to be giving perks to the local businesses and the local politicians. And that's the difference with the Russians. The Russians know how to play the game in the Balkans, but also in the wider region. They have more experience and better connections. The Chinese might learn over time, but it's still a story in the making.
I would very much agree with that, and I think we've seen sort of expanded Chinese engagement in the Caucasus and the Balkans. It is always these sort of regional approaches, but it does sort of lack the political vision of what they want to yield, and I think that's why so many of the projects seem to not really finish, or they sort of leave halfway through, or they start with this big vision and it sort of boils down to a small thing, because there isn't yet the political drive behind the reason that they're there, which actually really matters. And I think the most you see in some cases is sort of, you know, UN vote leverage, sort of leftover Africa strategies in terms of how they're applying economic leverage. But I have not seen yet the sort of focus on the what do we want out of this. But they are there. They're definitely an actor, primarily in the economic lane. But that's more, I still see it as more market-driven and sort of access to resource-driven than anything else.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good laydown, and obviously something we're tracking, but that doesn't have the political, the same political dynamics as others active in the region.
Thank you very much. The gentleman in the back row, please.
Good morning. My name is Gordon Duguid. I'm a former DCM at the U.S. Embassy in Belgrade. I'm currently with the National Intelligence University I'd like to take issue with the narrative advice. The people in the region know very well what the narrative is, and they understand the difference between the US and Russia. We say, come on our side, it's going to be hard, it'll take a lot of work, we're not going to bribe you to do it, and in the end you'll be better off. The Russians say, you're nice, we like you, we're going to give you stuff. And by the way, we'll give you extra things under the table at some point. And you know, you mentioned about the MiGs being a big deal. They would be if they were there. I understand there's bits of them that have been promised someday. And it's the same way with the helicopters, with South Stream, with other things. The people aren't fooled by this. There is a driving incentive for Russian influence, and it's money. And I agree with you that high-level engagement is needed to counter that. But we do have a narrative, and it is, if you want your children to stay home, come with us. If you want to go with the Russians, figure out how far you have to fly to see your grandkids. Thanks.
Thank you. Molly, perhaps you would like to...
So I'm not sure that we disagree, actually. My point was about a compelling narrative. And the problem is the narrative that you've just laid out is the narrative that we've been using in places like Moldova and Hungary and other countries. And this is why we are losing influence and the ability to integrate the European partners effectively into a whole. And it's not that I disagree with you. Obviously, the message needs to be, if you want to be at the table, you have to play by the rules, you have to do the work. But it's not enough when we know what's on the other side of this equation. And yes, the people know, yes, Europe whole, free, and at peace. But we are not actively promoting that on a day-to-day basis. At the embassy level, absolutely. You know, at the ground level, I'm not questioning the commitment and work of our diplomats. But that needs to come from Washington. People need to see it. It has an influence on the EU. The EU also is adrift in terms of what the future is. Are we integrating more members? Are we not? Are we aggressive on this? Does the Eastern Partnership still exist? Does it not? There's all these questions that would be better answered with the US and the EU working more strongly together than they are right now. But I do think the narrative point is extremely valid when, we can't threaten people into wanting to be in the EU. That is not going to work. And you are absolutely right that the Russian influence is primarily money, and the rest of it is sort of, hey, look, here's a shiny object, maybe it'll show up or not. But the emotive factor, this we're nice, we like you, has such a huge effect when you're talking about Moldova or the Balkans, this sort of pan-Slavic brotherhood that may be real or not. It means something to countries that have, in the not too distant past, lost everything and had to rebuild, that are still subject to not the best governance, with a lot of corruption, with a lot of inequality within their societies. And we know how effectively the Russians leverage those divides. We have seen it well beyond the Balkans. And that is where we need to play. I don't just mean narrative in terms of what's the US narrative on policy in the Balkans. It is the what vision of the world are we promoting there? What is the voice with which we speak? What are the stories that we're telling? And it's like a huge flood of Russian promoted content. And that's not just about how great Russia is, it's also about local things. And there's sort of this massive narrative coming from the other side, and then like a little stream of, don't you want to be in Europe? We have lots of money too. And that isn't enough. And that's my only point, that we need a compelling vision in the region.
But there's a shift of the Russian narrative. I mean, the billions of Russian investment flowing in the region is the old story. It doesn't apply anymore because, first of all, it's not true. The money is not there. The billions never materialized. But second, and of course, Russia was hit by the economic crisis in 2008, and now the sanctions. So there is not that much money to splash out. I mean, there might be targeted money here and there that makes a difference. Certainly, there's the perception in Serbia that Russia is a big donor, but the reality is very different. I mean, the EU is the big spender of Russia. Trails even other players like the Japanese, if you look at development assistance in the region. So Russian money is a bit of a myth. I think the more powerful narrative right now is the negative messaging about the West. The West is bad, it's arrogant, it's decadent. It also colludes with radical Islam and all those nasty refugees or false refugees coming into the region, ISIS, Al-Qaeda. This is the kind of emotional appeal. Nazism, Ukraine being a Nazi puppet regime. These are the kind of messages that resonate, less so the dream about the influx of Russian money. How you combat, I don't know. I mean, there will always be bias for this negative narrative because it kind of feeds into memories of the Kosovo War. Resentment is there. But still, voters in many Balkan countries tend to be mainstream. They are mildly nationalistic, but they know viscerally that the future is in the West. And think about what happened in Serbia 2016. All those anti-NATO demonstrations trying to challenge Vučić, because Vučić was a sellout, having the agreement with NATO. They didn't go that far to boost the radicals, Kostunica and all the others. In fact, I think they legitimized Vučić as the reasonable mainstream politician. So there is a mainstream, even in Serbia, which tends to be mildly pro-Russian, but it's not necessarily anti-Western or not radically pro-Western. And one caveat about the mix as well, the question we should be asking about the mix is, what are the costs of having the mix in operation?
Yeah.
I mean, the small print again, how much it costs to service it and provide maintenance costs that goes back to the big corporation in Russia. There might be a donation, but down the road, there'll be money to be paid back to Moscow. Vučić probably doesn't care. It's a PR stunt. It looks good in the tabloid papers, resonates with his base. But ultimately, it will be the Serbian taxpayer footing the bill. And maybe the US has a better narrative there because it has a better deal to sell F-16s in the region.
But not yet. I think maybe just one point to supplement what you just said, because I think it's important. I do think there is, especially in Serbia, it's this pro-Russian but not kind of thing. Yeah. But there is still a huge urban-rural divide in all, I think, all Balkan countries that is worth paying more attention to, especially in terms of how we engage and the impact of Russian information in that space. Especially on some of the negative, the EU is Nazis and refugees and terrorists stuff, because that's very real, and I know we all sort of laugh at it, but it also has traction in our countries. It's something we need to pay attention to.
So I want to go back actually to the idea of our narrative and how we can make it more compelling, and I think one key here is momentum. I think there is a feeling, or at least there was before June, that momentum had stalled. And I know that when we were in Podgorica, we certainly felt that there was a sense of buoyancy in the region, that Montenegro crossing over the threshold had really helped to reignite sort of that flame of hope in the region. But it's incumbent on all of us to try to build that momentum. And I would say on the US and EU side, it's incumbent on us, as I said, to make sure that the doors to NATO and the EU remain open and that we're providing all the support that we can to help countries on that path. But it's also up to the countries of the region, because you mentioned Moldova. And I think it's a cautionary tale, because there is also the possibility of damaging the credibility of the narrative if you have governments that are nominally pro-European but aren't making the tough decisions that are required. And people aren't benefiting from reforms and seeing that impact in their day-to-day lives. And there is a real risk that they stop believing that the European path will provide those benefits, that there is the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. And so I think we all need to redouble our efforts to create additional momentum, because we do have a real moment of opportunity. And we do have countries that have governments that are working toward these reforms, but we all need to have that sense of urgency behind them.
I think we have, I wanted to say, I think we have time for a couple of more questions, but please, Damon.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask the panel, you're talking about great power politics and you focused understandably quite a bit on Russia, but can you speak a little bit to the role of other outside powers in the region who have stepped up their profile? The role of Turkey, a NATO ally that's been perhaps behind some new faith-based parties in Macedonia, for example, the role of Saudi UAE funds throughout the region as well, and the nexus with some of the concerns that have been voiced, sometimes debunked, about foreign fighters or radicalization.
Thank you. Who would like to tackle that first? Maybe you, Dimitar?
Well, that's my other hat as a Turkey expert, and I can talk Turkey for another day. Turkey is different than Russia in the sense that Russia is in the region, but it's not of the region, to quote Churchill. Turkey is of the region. It's linked economically, but also in human connections. I mean, you saw it. Erdogan goes to Serbia, goes to Sanjak, and the X number of people turning up because they have their relatives in Turkey. So the level of connectivity is much denser. And much has been said about the Turkish economic presence in the Western Balkans. But if you look at Southeast Europe as a larger region, the countries that trade with Turkey the most are not the Western Balkans, it's Romania, just the size, first of all, and then Bulgaria. Size, proximity, but also another aspect that is often missed, EU customs union. So Turkey is not only a member of NATO, it's a member of, or part of the EU sphere, with or without Erdogan. It's much more integrated. 80% of investment into Turkey comes from the EU. And that's why Turkey is present in the Balkans, not just because of history, but because it's already, like the Western Balkans, part of those institutions and cooperation frameworks in the region. Now, of course, under Erdogan, this whole Turkish impulse to be an independent player, a great power in your own right, has become stronger. But I'm not sure what, again, the long-term agenda the Turks have in the region. Much of policy was focused on the Middle East. The Balkans were an afterthought. They can make life difficult sometimes for the West, but many of their ambitions backfired. You remember how they wanted to step into Bosnia and mediate when the EU and the US failed? Well, they didn't go very far. If anything, they gave ammunition to Milorad Dodik to say, oh, the Turks are coming. So rally behind the Serbian flag. I think there's a great deal of pragmatism. You saw it with Vučić and Erdogan. And finally, 50% of what Turkey wants to achieve in the Western Balkans, it seems to me right now at this juncture, is clamp down on the Gülenist network. Yeah. And it's an irony, right? I mean, those were the same people who were the vanguard of Turkish soft power back in the day. They provided education, business opportunities, networks. They were the flag bearers of Turkish foreign policy, and now Turkey sees them as liability and something to get rid of in Sanjak in Bosnia and elsewhere. So yeah, I mean, Turkey is present and will always be present, whatever the weather, in relations between the West and Turkey. And it probably occasionally wants to challenge the West, but I don't think it has the ability, the capacity to do much by way of spoiling the West. And the business agenda is still there. That's the driving force. Some things don't change, even with Erdogan, who is a politician who has captured the state. He does. There are underlying trends in Turkish-Balkan relations that will go on and have been around for a longer period of time.
Damon, maybe I can address the extremism and foreign fighters part of your question. I mean, which is that I think this is an issue that is sometimes raised as the specter of sort of there becoming a terrorist haven in the middle of Europe or something like that. And this is an issue that we've worked very closely with the countries of the region on, and really have strong partnerships. All of the countries of the region are members of the Defeat ISIS coalition, and we appreciate their contributions there deeply. But we also really appreciate the work that the countries of the region have done to put in place the legislative frameworks to address the foreign fighter issue, as well as creating resilience in those communities to prevent extremism from spreading in the first place. So it's an area that where we are working very closely with the countries of the region and have found very strong cooperation.
Maybe just a quick supplement to both of those things. I think the part of the difference in why we talk about Russia so much when we're talking about the Balkans is there are a number of other actors there. There are a lot of Turkey and some of the Middle Eastern countries, China, economic influence. There are a lot of people playing in the region, obviously, for normal reasons. I think where we, the West, should be strong and where everybody else should have a disadvantage is in presenting a positive forward-looking vision to this region. This is where you belong. This is what will happen if these things move the right way. This is what will happen if you hold your governments to account for doing all the things that they say they're going to do for you. This should be a positive narrative or positive value proposition being presented, and we are the only ones doing that. Nobody else comes to the Balkans and says, this is why you are great and this is where you belong. But we're not winning that, and I think that's where that really emotive piece comes from the Russian side. Since nobody is really coming with this value proposition anymore, there is this very emotional, don't you remember when we were all great? Wouldn't this be something that would be fun again? Oh, by the way, everybody else is a Nazi or a terrorist. That has a lot of impact, and it's said very cheekily, but it does have a lot of impact. And I think this game that and in the Russian information space, there's a lot of this who's a terrorist narrative from a lot of different places. They're using it in the Balkans for a reason, the same way that when they're talking about Ukraine or ISIS in Syria, there's this constant reference to Georgians being the real ISIS, Georgians being the assassins in the Maidan. The Russians like to label anybody they don't like as a Nazi or a terrorist. And it gives them great leverage to sort of pull strings, especially in the intelligence space and the way that they feed information into intelligence services, which sometimes has a lot of impact, and it's something we need to pay more attention to. Turkey is also playing in this game partially with Gulenist accusations, but also on ISIS. That whole space of what is ISIS now, and ISIS is increasingly Russian-speaking and from former Soviet states and looking at Europe and not looking at the Middle East anymore. That's something that we need to pay attention to because it's not disconnected from Russia. It's not disconnected from Turkey either. And I don't think there's enough attention being paid to why the narrative is what it is in other places and why they're pulling on those threads. But I would just put that out there as a cautionary note for the future.
Thank you very much. That's really a very thoughtful, a thought planted really deeply at this conference. We do have some more time for questions, please, if there are any. Anybody else? Can I, please? I was just about to break the protocol and ask a question myself. Please go ahead.
I have a question for the Mali P representative. So what is the U.S. saying or doing or reacting to the coup attempt in Montenegro in 2016?
So, I mean, I think our position has been that we certainly support the efforts of Montenegro's government to hold those who are responsible to account. And I think we also have answered, not just the United States, but the alliance in not allowing that attempt to succeed in what was really its goal, which was to prevent Montenegro from achieving NATO membership. And so I think that has spoken loud and clear.
And it's really important, this whole trial, to be as transparent as possible to resist all claims that it's a political witch hunt. I mean, because they're indicted leaders of the opposition. I might not vote for them, but there is a concern about rule of law. So it's really important for Montenegro to conduct that in a fair and transparent manner. So if there is guilt, that needs to be proven in due process. Because otherwise, we fall back into the same pattern of state capture and justice which is compromised, which is the original sin in the region. And Montenegro has a great opportunity now I think they'll seize it. And that kind of ties to Turkey again. One final thought that the report itself talks about the great man being the problem in the Balkans. And who is the greatest of them all? Somebody sitting in Ankara. So this model of a strong national leader who resists Europe but delivers modernization might have resonance in the Balkans. Maybe Putin is not, I mean, he's a different ball game altogether, but the Erdoganization of Balkan politics, or urbanization, is the threat. So many people would say Montenegro is an example as well with the great man there all. But now, the day NATO and there's this file, there's a chance for Montenegrin democracy to prove the naysayers that progress has been made.
And I would just add to that I think it would be really great if we, the United States, would take more leadership with our European allies on sitting down and talking about what Russian influence and intelligence operations actually look like in all of our countries. And it's not just, we're not paying attention, it's more, a lot of the things that happen are things that, it's the way that the cyberspace used to work. If you had a huge cyber attack, for the most part, people used to not talk about it because it was a huge vulnerability that you were projecting. And now that information sharing is increased when there's cyber attacks on different countries, there needs to be more attention on how the GRU operates in all of our countries, how the informal actors that Russia is cultivating are acting and are being funded in all of our countries. And that kind of information exchange is not yet happening. And I hope that there will be more of that moving forward.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes, please. The lady in the third row. Here, thank you. Yes, thank you.
So Dimitar, this is a question that comes from your book, but it's addressed generally to the panel. And you had mentioned that Russia works so well in the Balkans because of their pragmatic approach and being able to work with all actors. My question is, to what extent would you judge that the US and the EU have been pragmatic in their approach to working with all potential actors in achieving the reforms and integrating the Balkans into the EU?
Excuse me, could you please introduce yourself?
Oh, sure. Amanda Brown from Brownstein Hyatt.
Thank you very much.
Well, the EU is a different animal. It has a very different set of foreign policies because it's driven by certainly member state interests, which allows flexibility, but also there is a body of law and there's a set of underlying principles. So there are limits to what extent the EU can do all those Faustian bargains. The Russians don't have any of those constraints to operate. I mean, they can be friends with everyone. They can be friends with liberals, with Islamists, with nationalists, you name it. But with civil society, with the church, with Muslim leaders, I mean, that's the new Russia. That's why it's different from the Soviet Union, which had ideology. In the short term, that's great for the Russians, because they get mileage out of it. But then, I think in the long term, they will find hard to compete against the EU and the West in general, because structurally there are a lot of things going on for the West. It's the economy and society. So I want to end on a positive message that pragmatism is good, but it doesn't get you as far as people think.
Very briefly, because we have a minute left, if you can be really brief, we need to wrap it up. I'm sorry that you cannot, we have to wrap it up, so. Next session, exactly. Thank you very much to all the panelists. There are great panel discussions coming up this afternoon, so hopefully many of you can join us and ask the questions that regrettably you did not ask at this panel. Thank you very much.
And buy the book.